Delighted to be talking to you today, Gabor, and thank you very much for joining us from quite a long way away from where I am at the moment. I've been lucky enough to see an early draft of your new book, The Myth of Normal, and I imagine that quite a few of the people who are watching us are very familiar with your work because there are lots of videos and talks around on the internet. But I'm also assuming there's going to be a few people at least who are new to your work. So I wanted just to kick off by summarising how I understand some of its main themes to be, and perhaps then you can elaborate on if that's how you see it. And we can have a bit of an informal conversation together. So you've worked with people with addictions and with people with various psychiatric diagnoses and with a number of other groups of people. And in all those cases, and also in fact, in the case of some people with clear physical health problems, you trace the roots back to childhood trauma, but you also put trauma in a much wider social, cultural and political context. Is that a kind of reasonable summary of one of the core themes of your work?
That's as good a summary as I've ever heard. So my background is that of a family physician, which meant that for 20 years I delivered babies and I looked after old people. I also worked in palliative care, working with the dying. So I covered the whole range of human experience from conception to death, really. And then for 12 years, I worked in North America's most concentrated area of drug use, which is in Vancouver, British Columbia. And I worked with people heavily dependent on substances of all kinds and who've been diagnosed with all kinds of mental health conditions as well. So that's been my background. And yes, in all of those realms, I've seen the impact of childhood experience. And as you say, not just in what is called mental illness, but also in physical illness, from malignancy to autoimmune disease. So that I think life experience, beginning with even in the womb and certainly in childhood, has a huge role to play in, not a huge role to play, is the major impact on people's physiology, including the functions of their bodies and brains. And all this happens in a social context. So the whole point is that there's a word called biopsychosocial that refers to the inseparability of people's biology from their psychological and social experiences. And all that, of course, happens in the context of family, community, culture, economy, and politics. So the manifestation of illness in any one human being manifests something about the environment, including the broader environment in every case.
I think it's really important to put that wider context in, isn't it? And to see the links between the person and the much wider environment. And if I can bring this up as well, you've been very open about the fact that your own life was impacted by trauma really from, very early age, from in fact when you were born. And I guess that's part of what's led you into this area of interest. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
A little bit. I've just talked about this so often that I don't know how much more I need to say about it, but clear fact of being born a Jewish infant in Hungary during the Second World War, while the city was being bombed by the Allies, which happened after the Germans occupied the country when I was 2 months of age, and then being Jewish, and then the whole family facing the trauma of the genocide, my grandparents being deported and killed in Auschwitz when I was a few months old, the emotional state of my mother, the absence of my father in a forced labor battalion with the Hungarian army, the deprivation, the terror that we went through, separation from my mother for 4 to 6 weeks, which was her way of saving my life. Of course, all that had a major impact on who I became, how I saw the world. And what I was interested in later on as a physician is how to understand people's issues in terms of their life experience. All that yes, was a major impact and continues to be on our life.
Sure. It's not like these things ever vanish, is it? But we kind of
Yeah.
learn from them. We learn to manage them. We learn to come to terms with them. But
Yeah.
these things get passed down the generations, don't they? As well as coming at us from the wider culture at any given moment.
Yes, and certainly, as my children could tell you, I certainly passed it on to them, and nobody does this deliberately or consciously. It's just what happens until we wake up, get conscious, and come to terms, as you say. They just govern the patterns of our lives and our interactions and our reactions and relationships, and then that's the context the next generation grows up in. So that's just how it works.
Yeah, that's true of all of us. And you had perhaps in some ways a particularly difficult start in life, you and your family, but it's true of all of us, I guess. And, it's a lifelong journey, as I'm sure you'd agree, to come to terms with that. And we never reach an end point. That's kind of what it's about, isn't it?
Well, we do reach an end point.
Reach an end point in terms of our physical bodies, yes.
When they bury us, we reach the end point. Lucy, I've often joked about, I've written my epitaph, the thing that I want carved on my gravestone. It's going to say, it was a lot more work than I had anticipated.
That could be true for all of us.
I think so.
So I'd like to try a question that I often get posed, which is, okay, so if we think about the trauma, there will be a number of people who say, quite rightly in some senses, well, I'm really struggling with what we call mental health, and yet I had a safe and secure upbringing, and I haven't faced any major classic events like childhood sexual abuse. So what would be your response to people who don't have obvious traumas in their backgrounds? Does your perspective still hold in those cases?
Well, there's a number of things I would say in response to that. Number one, partly it has to do with how we see the word trauma. So trauma, like any other word, depends very much on our understanding of it. So when I say to somebody, do you believe in God? That depends very much on one's definition of God. There's people who define God in ways that others don't understand at all. So God could be the life force in the whole universe, or it could be a vindictive old man in the sky. So it depends on what we mean by the word. And so trauma is one of these words that all depends on context. So if the people that you cite say, I was not sexually abused, I was not beaten, my father wasn't an alcoholic, my parents didn't hate each other, then I understand. Yeah, okay, you didn't have trauma. But that's not how I define trauma. I define trauma based on its root origin, and the Greek origin of the word trauma is wound. So to be wounded, you don't have to have been beaten, sexually abused, your parents at each other's throats, family, addiction. All you have to have been is a sensitive child who emotionally wasn't held and seen and heard for who they were. So that's my first answer, is it all depends on what we mean by trauma. So by trauma, I mean a deep wounding. But by the way, I don't mean the wounding, because here's what it gets a bit subtle here. Trauma is not what happened to you. So trauma is not that you were sexually abused, if you were. That's not the trauma. The trauma is what happened inside you as a result of having been sexually abused, or whatever else happened. So trauma is the internal wound. It's not the external event. So the question isn't whether terrible things happened to you. The question is, were you wounded? And how did that wound affect you? And how are you defending against that wound? Now, the British child psychiatrist, pediatrician D.W. Winnicott pointed out once that there's two things that can go wrong in childhood. One is when things happen that shouldn't have happened. Those are the traumas that we just talked about. But also when things don't happen that should have happened, which is the parent being emotionally attuned and connected with the child. Now, what I can tell you, Lucy, is that in hundreds of talks that I've given, in thousands of people who I've spoken to, when anybody says exactly what you said, I had a perfectly happy childhood, secure, it takes me 3 minutes of asking a few questions and they get it. That what they thought was a happy childhood, it's not that their memories of happiness were not accurate. It's that people don't remember what didn't happen. It's that people take certain things for granted, that this is just normal. So that when I ask them, if you ever felt sad or unhappy, who would you speak to? The answer is going to be 100% of the time, nobody. Well, if that's the case, how does that feel to a small child, not to have anybody to speak to when they're sad? So I'm telling you, I understand what people are saying. I've just never found it to be true. Never, ever found it to be true.
Okay, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I guess what we have to be careful to do, and I know you're not saying this, is to kind of slip into, oh, we're blaming parents, etc., etc. And that's where I think it's, and I'm sure you would agree with this, it's important to put in the wider society and culture, isn't it? What is it that enables parents to give their children the best start in life and so on?
Yeah, so that's the first point. The second point is the one you've already made, which is that it's multi-generational. So I know that I passed my trauma on to my kids. I also know that I did my best and I was a good parent in terms of I did the best I could.
Okay.
If I look back what happened, I can see how my behaviors and attitudes and reactions and how the emotional atmosphere in our home would have wounded our kids. It's not because I meant to. If I could live my life over again, believe me, I'd live it very differently. So it's not, it's never a question of blaming a parent because it's multi-generational. Secondly, it is in a social context. So let's just nail something down. And I write about it, this is my new book. Not original to me, it's just a fact. Human beings did not evolve in the kind of context that we have established today. Human beings we've been on the earth, this species that we belong to, Homo sapiens, has been around for 150,000, 200,000 years. Well, until if midnight is the beginning of human life 200,000 years ago, I mean our species life, and if noon is our present situation, then until about 11:55 minutes, we lived in small hunter-gatherer groups, where parenting wasn't a matter of isolated families, parents having to rush away to work, leaving the kids behind, parents lacking social support. It was parenting by the whole community. And so that the onus wasn't an individual, on a young father or a young mother to meet all the needs of the child without support. And this has been studied extensively. We're talking about small band hunter-gatherer groups. So that's how we evolved. So when we talk about the context, what we have to realize is we're living in a context now that has been called species alien. It's alien to our species needs. That parents, quite apart from the multi-generational trauma that we've talked about, parents are not operating in a context that really supports them. In fact, they operate in a context that actually undermines them in many, many, many ways. So that's why there's no room for blaming individual parents. And I worked with this highly addicted population, and every single one of them had been severely abused or traumatized in childhood by their parents who had been similarly traumatized in their own childhoods. So in Canada, we have the very lamentable case example of our First Nations or Aboriginal population who parented beautifully in ways that we can't even imagine. Were so functional and so good and so nurturing. They knew exactly how to parent until colonialism very deliberately and consciously went out to destroy their communities and their community lives and their spiritual ways and their ways of seeing them, and then traumatized them, robbed them of their children, sent them to residential schools where they were sexually and physically abused. And this went on for 100 years. So now in those communities, kids are often abused. But do you blame those parents? You know, so, but it's a case example. And this also happens to be, by some strange accident, the segment of our population that is most likely to be addicted, most likely to have diabetes, most likely to have autoimmune disease like arthritis, and so on. Diseases that they never used to have. So there's no room for blame here, but there is room for understanding what's going on so that we can do something about it.
Sure, well, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, as a parent myself, you know, until I became a parent, I don't think I really realised what an impossible task we're kind of setting ourselves, you know, to live within our isolated nuclear families within four walls without family support around the corner, perhaps never have even held a baby before, you know, and also got to live up to all sorts of expectations about how we should be as parents, how our children should be as children. I mean, it's an unbelievably difficult task that we kind of set ourselves and are set by our current culture and society. And you've traced it back a long way to the whole way that our societies are organised. And not just have we done fairly terrible things within Westernized societies, we've done even worse things to non-Western cultures who are suffering even more, which is a horrendous thing to admit and own up to, isn't it?
Well, and just as within certain families, there's denial, so that families will deny that abuse happened. It clearly did. And even when it's documented, you know, that some people just can't deal with it. And even within a family, one child will, as an adult, will realize that they've been abused, but everybody's going to deny it and they're going to be ostracized. Well, the same denial functions on the social level as well. And I'm not saying this to guilt anybody. I'm just saying that denial is a fact of political, social, and personal life. And if you walk around, I don't mean to go with my British audience here, but if you walk around, and the same thing is true in Canada, as I'm telling you. And if you walk around Trafalgar Square, you'll see several statues of British commanders who made distinguished themselves by massacring the natives, you know, in various parts of the empire. And we don't, and this is traumatic, and it's painful for people to recognize not only what was done to them, but what they did to others.
Yeah, indeed.
So that there's powerful dynamics that keeps us from looking at all the traumas in society.
Yeah, which is very much what Judith Herman says in her book, Trauma and Recovery, isn't it? That trauma operates at all sorts of levels: individual, familial, social, cultural, you know, and it's all about denial. And what can happen if you're, in effect, the person who speaks up about it is you can meet with considerable attempts to silence you. And I wonder if you faced some of that. And I'm guessing you certainly have, because in a sense, you're blowing the whistle on some of this, aren't you?
I can't complain too much about the response. I mean, my books have been published in 25 languages, and I get all kinds of great feedback from it. Within my own profession, I've had a lot of appreciation and a lot of dismissal as well, as happens to anybody. Because I mean, what I'm saying about modern medicine is that for all its brilliant achievements, and they have to be acknowledged and celebrated, at the same time, because it ignores trauma, because it largely ignores the biopsychosocial nature of human beings, it ignores the mind-body unity, it ignores the impact of life experience on the brain and on the body. It's working out of a very narrow framework. And this is true in all realms of medicine conditions.
Yeah, which is what the ACE studies imply, among other things, isn't it? That whatever the problem,
absolutely,
certainly including physical health problems, we need to ask about the context of people's lives. And I guess one of the particular ways we have of not asking and not listening and denying is to impose the diagnostic model of what are called mental health problems, which is the concern of most people listening today, I'm guessing. Yeah. So if I understand you right, you're kind of saying the problem certainly isn't just in psychiatry, it's in general medicine as well, where our understandings are far too narrow, where we exclude the personal, the social, the relational, which, you know, that's your area of expertise, not mine, but I can, you know, I think that's very true. And I think it's absolutely true that in psychiatry we don't ask questions. And I think I would push it further and say we actively stop people asking, you know.
And not only that, I think as Joanne Moncrief and you have pointed out accurately, in the rest of medicine, at least we have some physical evidence to go on, like, you know.
Indeed, we have some justification for the medical,
Yeah,
even if it's
but
narrow
like
in general medicine,
in
we have
multiple
some
sclerosis,
justification for it.
in multiple sclerosis, you can do an MRI, you can do a
Sure.
scan, and you can show the areas in the brain where there's a loss of myelin, which is the fatty sheath that surrounds nerves, you know. In psychiatry, a number of assumptions have been made. For example, that depression is caused by lack of serotonin. That's still the mantra. And that this is genetic. Well, there's no evidence for any of that. We know that there's no evidence. Nobody's ever shown that lack of serotonin causes depression. Now, it may be. I can certainly, this is where it gets complicated, because I took a medication that increased serotonin, and lo and behold, it helped me. But that doesn't mean that my disease, first of all, that I had disease, or that disease was caused by lack of serotonin.
That's an important distinction, isn't
You know,
it? That
now
drugs
life
can have a role, but it doesn't prove a disease model.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Good to hear you say that the chemical imbalance theory has never had any evidence, because most people don't know that. Most people don't know.
not only that, for all the, I mean, I just researched this for my book, and I'm telling you, I went through the literature with a fine-tooth comb. The belief that bipolar illness, for example, is genetic, which is just a mantra. There is zero evidence for it. Zero evidence.
It's again, it's important to have a physician saying that. You know, I often say that.
Yeah.
You say with more authority that really isn't any evidence for these.
And even if you can show that something runs in the family, which sometimes it does, it still doesn't mean that it's genetic.
No, being a doctor runs in the family.
Right? What did you say?
Being a doctor runs in families quite often. I mean, it's.
I've made that case that just because none of my kids became doctors, but if they did, that wouldn't automatically prove that being a doctor is a genetic disease. You know,
Exactly.
Could be, but but that doesn't prove it, because we create environments from one generation to the next, just as I know from personal experience. You know, so I think that for the purposes of our discussion, what's really important here is that, however accurate diagnosis may be as descriptors, and however helpful it may be to recognize those patterns, that's got to be just the beginning of the inquiry of what happened in your life and what is happening in your life to keep those patterns going.
Yeah, as we say, we need to ask not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you.
What happened to you, and in what ways, unwittingly, are you continuing to generate the same patterns?
Sure, perpetuating things, yeah.
You know, like if you take something like depression, which is a very simple concept. I mean, all you have to do is look at the word depression. What does it mean to depress something? It means to push it down. So why did you push down your emotions? Well, because as a kid, there was no room for it in your family of origin. So you had to push it down. How are you still doing that? So it's not enough to say to somebody, well, here's what happened to you. The really important question is, how's that showing up in your life right now? And,
Yeah.
and in what aspects of your life are perpetuating those patterns to this present day?
Indeed. How are you trying to survive it? How did you try to survive it, and how are you
Yeah.
still to survive it? And that's really, really important advice for people like us, for
Yeah.
clinicians. I wonder, and we need to kind of wrap up fairly soon, but so I wonder if you have some general thoughts about ways forward, you know, for all of us. What kind of steps can we take about bringing about a more humane understanding of what are called mental health problems, and how optimistic you feel about the future?
Well, first of all, that's the title of my book, The Myth of Normal, Illness and Health in an Insane Culture.
Buy your book is the first piece of advice, of course. Yes.
No, nothing to buy. I got to finish it first. My God.
Okay.
That's not, I can't advise that yet. It won't be out for another year at least.
I'm advising it.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Read it in draft and enjoyed it.
At this point, my concern is to finish it, believe me. But it's to recognize that the whole idea of normal is a myth. That what is called abnormal is actually normal responses to situations that are, from the human point of view, abnormal. So that drop the stigma that there's anything wrong with you or anybody else. Question is, what was the context that you're trying to adapt to? How did that serve you? And how does that not serve you anymore? But there's no stigma. So when I teach people my way of therapy, the essential thing is that every part of you that you don't like or that doesn't work for you right now, at some point had a useful function. So you have to accept all parts of you, including the depressed part and the part that's angry and the part that's jealous and the part that's petty. I'm putting those in quotation marks. So that they're all there for a reason. And they're all subject to inquiry as to how they came along.
And that would apply to all of us, wouldn't it? Not just those people who have mental illness labels. That would apply to all.
Well, that's the whole point. That is that there's a spectrum, isn't it? So that there are very few people in society. I've never met a schizophrenic, so-called, or a psychotic, or an addict, or a depressed person, or a bipolar person, where I didn't at least recognize some aspects of their functioning in myself. Maybe not to the same degree, but sometimes closer than I'd like to have admitted, you know, but in other words, it's a spectrum and we're all on it. So there's no separating the normal from the abnormal in that sense.
Yeah, that's an important message. And how close do you think we are to, you know, having that as our default understanding, if you like, to moving towards understandable responses to difficult circumstances rather than our current way of looking at health problems?
How close are we?
That's an impossible question to answer, of course, but do you see some?
Well, what I do know is that there's much more listening to these kind of conversations than there ever used to be. You know, so that just judging by my own experience, there's been an exponential interest in looking at these questions. Big conferences, tons of people, you know, all the wonderful books that have been written on trauma, in which I'll humbly include my own, but many, many, many others. So to answer your question, in some ways we're getting closer, there's more interest, there's more understanding, but on the social level, boy, oh boy, we're far away. And everything I've said about obesity, of course, also applies to what's called mental illness as well. Social inequality, stress, isolation, stress on families. This is what drives the rising rate of psychiatric diagnoses. But we're not going to deal with them on a social level until there's a much deeper transformation. And that, I can't predict when that's going to happen.
Okay, thank you. it's a really promising sign, I think, that your books and talks have been so widely viewed and there's such a lot of interest. So let's hope that's really the start of and part of a kind of, a really shifting of paradigms where we can actually look at some of these social root causes. But thank you very much for talking to us today. And I really hope for people who aren't familiar with your work, this inspires people to read your existing books, look out for your new book, and maybe look at some of your talks on YouTube. So thank you very much.
And thank you for your work, because your work has gone right into my new book. So
that's an excellent.
It's good to have colleagues across the sea, huh?
Indeed, and that's part of the purpose of this whole event.
Yeah.
We need to kind of support each other and work together to bring about these changes. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.